Should we start?
Yeah.
All right. Now so we're officially beginning. Welcome everybody tonight. I'm Julia Landau from Mass Advocates for Children. Welcome to our monthly chats. I am sure you are also, we're trying to wrap your head around the fact that we are getting up to the 1-year anniversary of the pandemic and the school closures and everything that you and your children have been experiencing over this last year. We certainly all expected a year ago that we would be in a much different place than we are right now. And we know how difficult it's been for so many of you as you continue to strive and advocate to get the communication going with the school so you can really make sure that your children's IEPs are being fully implemented the way the law promises. And we know for many of you, there's still just too many barriers. And maybe there's a light at the end of the tunnel as the vaccine slowly rolls out in our state, but we know the end is not immediately in sight. So we're thrilled to welcome Mike Gregory tonight to talk with us. There's a poll going up just so we know information about what type of disability your child has. Mike is managing attorney at the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, TLPI, that a lot of you may be familiar with. That's a partnership between MAC and Harvard Law School. He's a terrific attorney and wonderful colleague who's going to focus on how to communicate and some tips around communicating and advocating specifically for your child's needs, whether it's remote learning, in-person learning, and all the many changes that keep going back and forth as you try to navigate. The schools are open, they're closed, you're quarantined. It's relentless, and we know very, very tiring. A couple housekeeping things that I'm going to turn to Lilia for.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. So tonight we'll be pausing throughout the presentation to take your questions. Please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. For those of you joining us on Facebook, please submit your question as a comment under the live stream. If you see someone else's question that you'd like us to answer, please give it a like. And keep an eye on the chat box in Zoom and in the comment section on Facebook for resources and announcements we'll share throughout the presentation. Thanks.
And the one thing I forgot to do is also, a lot of you know her, she's been here every chat, is Joanne Pino, also is joining us from the MAC team. And I think we'll just turn it over to you, Mike. Thanks so much for being here.
All right, well, thanks for having me. Really good to be with everybody tonight. I'm going to start by sharing my screen because I have some slides to share. So let me get that up. And then that always moves all of my screens around, and I got to get things back in order. There we go. Is that coming through? Great. As Julia said, I work for a project called the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, which is a partnership between MAC and Harvard Law School. Part of what we do at the Harvard Law School is teach an education law clinic. And through that clinic, we represent families in the special education system. So that's the work that I do every day and have been doing, gosh, I guess this is my 17th year. But I will just say that almost 5 years ago, my husband and I adopted our daughter, Bella. And she participated in early intervention and now has an IEP through the Boston Public Schools. And so I think I was a lawyer for about, 12 years or so, not having been a parent. And then I had the experience of being a parent and a lawyer, and then actually going through the IEP process as a parent myself. And so I've kind of have worn both of those hats. And as long as I had been doing legal advocacy and had been trained as a lawyer, when you're sitting in the seat as a parent, it's a whole different ballgame. And so I've had that experience, and we've been adapting to COVID and to the services that she's been receiving remotely. So I bring that experience with me tonight. You know what I thought I would do is really just say at the outset, like, there's no magic fix for making this work. I mean, we're a year in, as Julia said, and like if there were a magic way to make this all work, we would have figured it out by now. And so if you're struggling, I'm struggling, my clients are struggling. We're just, waking up every day and doing the best we can and trying to just keep advocating for what our kids need. So, there's really no magic fix tonight. What I thought I would do is just speak about 4 tools that I've been using in my own work as an attorney, that I've been using on behalf of my own daughter, things that I found can sometimes make a difference or help make the process work a little better. And that's what I decided to share with you and focus on tonight. So let me get about sharing those things. The first is a tool that's out there called a homeschool communication letter that I'm going to show you in a minute, and that can really help, I found, in just establishing good communication with the school. For me, that's kind of like the foundation for everything else. If there's not good communication going on back and forth between home and school, it makes everything else so much harder. So I'll share a tool with you about that. Second, I've been in so many meetings recently where the school really just wants to focus narrowly on a certain set of the students' needs. But gosh, if it's one thing COVID's done, it's just really opened up for so many kids needs that maybe weren't there before, or that were, but are different, or that have been exacerbated. And I'm finding that it's really, really important to keep the focus as holistic as possible and really have a conversation that addresses all of the students' needs. So I'll share a tool with you that I've found helpful with that. The third, Julia referenced this, it's all these transitions. One day you're hybrid, one day you're remote, one day you're in person. In so many districts, it's been changing, and it's going to keep changing. And of course, knock on wood, we'll be back to quote unquote normal at some point, and that will be a big transition too. How do we plan for all of these transitions that can be unpredictable? And finally, kids have lost so much during this time. And there's so much that we'll never be able to give them back. But there is something called compensatory education. And for students on an IEP, although it will never be the same as it would have been if they had gotten their education in the first place, there are legal tools that can help us get back some of what's been lost. And so I want to share some tips about that. And that's what I plan to share tonight. So let's just take the first one. Establishing communication. Now, what you see on your screen here is the first page of a sample letter that has actually been put out by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And it's called the Homeschool Communication Letter. And it's a letter that parents can use to be proactive about helping educators understand the best practices for establishing communication with you, the ways that it works for you to communicate with the school on terms that are convenient for you. And I'm going to click on this link. By the way, the slides will be made available afterwards. And every place you see a link in the slide, it will be a clickable link that you can access if you download or find the slides. I'm sure Lilia will help us all know where to find the slides at the end. So I'm going to click this link and you'll see what this letter is and why I've found it to be helpful, and hopefully you will too. It's a writable PDF. What that means is you can download the PDF on your computer and you can actually type here in the fields. So you can address the letter. I think there's a field up here for the date too. You can put the date right in, like today's date, or oops, I clicked the wrong one. There's today's date. Then you can put in the name of your student, who you're the parent of. There's a place to designate if the primary language in your home is not English. And I'll say also that there's a Spanish version of this letter for Spanish-speaking families. Then you can come down here and indicate what's the best way to get a hold of you. Do you like email? Or maybe you don't like email, you like text, and you can list your phone number over here. It's a place to really be clear about what are the best modes of communication. And here I'll just share a little story that I was just hearing from an attorney colleague just 2 days ago. She had just been to an IEP meeting, and she said, what's the first thing they did in that meeting? They took out a spreadsheet to say to the parent, here are all the times we've tried contacting you. with dates and times, and you didn't get back to us. Well, this colleague of mine looked at the letter or that looked at the spreadsheet, and sure enough, it was all attempts to contact the parent by email. And this parent had told the school, don't contact me by email. I don't get emails. I don't read emails. And so they hadn't been using the mode of communication that the parent had requested. This letter is a way that you could be real clear and create a paper trail about how you'd like to be communicated with. Then there's places to list times and days that it's convenient to be contacted, or days where a parent might be working and not available. Please don't call me on these days. Or a place to say, my schedule actually changes regularly and I can't tell you a regular time to call me. Just please reach out in advance. Sometimes communication's easier when the person at the school is somebody that you feel comfortable with, that you actually have a good rapport with. Now, it doesn't obligate the school to use that person, but you could ask and request, hey, when you need to reach out with communications about my child, could you have so-and-so do it? Because I really have a good rapport with that person. Here's a box where you can say in the past, here are some things that have worked really well for communications with my family. And then here on the next page, here are some things that have not worked well for communication. Please don't use these ways. And then there's a section here specifically for families with students who have an IEP or a 504 plan. Again, to indicate the primary language of the home, not just for communications, but maybe interpreters are needed at meetings. And all IEP communications and evaluation should also be in a language other than English. Again, convenient and not convenient days and times for meetings, not just periodic communications, but to schedule meetings. How do you prefer to participate in IEP or 504 meetings? I don't know many that are being offered in person at this point, but do you like to participate virtually, or is phone better for you? You could indicate that. And finally, similarly, is there a member of the IEP team that you particularly appreciate receiving communications from? And you could request that. And then there's a place here that says, I would appreciate it if you could place this letter in my student's file and share it with all of the adults at school who teach or work with my student, so that everybody knows the best way to communicate with you. And then you can type in your name there and sign it, and just print it out and send the letter into the school. I mean, these are the kinds of things that as an attorney, I try to help schools understand about my own clients, but this letter hopefully is a tool that parents can use proactively to do this as a self-advocate as well. I'm going to close the letter and go back to the slides. Before we move on to the next, I'll just see if there's any questions or comments that it makes sense to address at this point.
I think we can keep going. I think you're going to address some stuff later on. So. Okay,
thanks, Lilia. So here's the next tool that I like to use, and it goes to this point about addressing students' needs holistically. This kind of tool is something we call the 4 domains for success. And it comes from some research that we've done at the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative about how best to support students who may have experienced trauma or adversity. Some really important studies have been done looking at students who had experienced trauma but went on to be successful at school nevertheless. And these studies looked at what were the things these students had in common that allowed them to be resilient and do really well, even though they may have had some troubling things that have happened in their background. And what they found is that there were 4 cross-cutting themes. 1, these students had relationships, good relationships with adults and peers. 2, they had developed skills to self-regulate their emotions, attention, and behavior. 3, they experienced a feeling of success at school, both academically, but also non-academically, perhaps. Maybe your success is sports or art or music or drama or socially. But kids experienced some degree of a feeling of success at school. And 4th, they had physical health and well-being. And so what this research says to us is that if we can bolster these 4 areas for kids, they're going to stand the best chance of doing well at school, even though they may have had some challenges in their life. Well, boy, who hasn't had challenges now? I mean, if you didn't have adversity before COVID, you sure do now. And so this is really relevant to everybody. And I think it helps us keep a holistic lens when we're looking at kids. I'm sure all of us have, or many of us have been in IEP meetings where the school kind of just wants to talk about the academics and the MCAS and the grades on the report card. But this is a way of saying, hey, there's so many more parts to this child, this student, and can we have a holistic discussion? So what this really is kind of like a worksheet. You could print out this slide and just collect your thoughts, your concerns, your questions in each of these 4 areas before you sit down at that IEP table, or before you, get on the phone call with the child's teacher, so that you're prepared and ready to have questions and concerns, or even successes in all 4 of these really important areas. So this is a tool that we use when we're starting to represent a new client. This is how we structure our interviews. We really want to know how the student is progressing or not progressing in each of these areas. And we've just found it to be a really helpful way of keeping that holistic lens. So I'll pause here again, Lily, and see if there's anything relevant to this slide before I go to the next.
No, I keep going.
Okay. So third, we talked about transitions. And I know for so many of the families that I'm working with, they've been through so many already. Just when you get used to like the hybrid mode, and the student going in partially, then the COVID rates go up and now everybody's back on remote. And I know, in one district that I'm working with a family on, like they just went back to hybrid this week after having been hybrid and then gone back to in-person and rather remote, and now they're back to hybrid. So I think that there's a tool that the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has put out that I think it's really good to remind ourselves of and go back to. And that's the Model Special Education Learning Plan. They've really highly recommended that, or even required, I'm not sure, Julia will know, required or at least highly recommended that every student have a written plan, I think it's required, that says when, how they're going to receive the services in their IEP. And so they put out a model plan. I mean, districts and schools can use any plan that they wish, but there's a model, and that's what you're seeing on the screen, and there's a link to it. And let me tell you why I think this is a helpful thing to have handy. If you have a school that you're working with that isn't really wanting to have a discussion about all of these transitions, or not wanting to do a written plan that really communicates things clearly to you, I think you could show them this model and say, look, this is what the state is recommending that you do. And if you look, I'm going to actually, I guess I can't make this any bigger. This might be hard to read some of this type on the screen, but what I want to point out, maybe you can follow my cursor, is that it has built right into it in-person instruction, remote learning instruction, and hybrid instruction. It contemplates that kids are going to be moving back and forth probably between these various modes, and we should plan for it up front and not wait. And I want to point out another thing, which is that the very first question in each of these categories tells the school to, and here I'll read it out loud, describe how and when the school or district obtained parental input regarding the proposed differences in provision of special ed services. That's the number one thing they got to do, is get the parents' input on how the student should be learning in each of these modes. So I offered this, I'm sure everybody, or many people know about this plan already, but if you have a school that is reluctant to engage in this conversation with you, I think it's really helpful to show them the model that the state has put out, which so clearly indicates that your input is needed for each of these modes of instruction, and that there should be one plan that contemplates all three modes, because we know kids will be moving back and forth.
So we do have a few questions that have come in. We can take a little break here.
Great.
Our first question is, what exactly are school districts doing to get children on IEPs into in-person learning? Do they have to follow any guidelines, or is it just up to individual districts?
So I'll say a few things about that, and then I'll invite my colleagues to share more information. So there are priority categories for, like, if a district is able, under public health guidelines, to offer any kind of in-person instruction, there are certain priority categories for which students, should be prioritized for coming back into the building first. And I don't have those in front of me, so I'm not going to probably remember what all of them are. But the rule of thumb is that the greater the needs the student has, the more specialized the services that they were getting before COVID, the more likely it is that they're going to be in one of those priority categories. So students who were in substantially separate classrooms would be prioritized. Students who are dually identified as having both disabilities and also as English language learners would be prioritized. Students who are either in congregate living facilities or who are categorized as homeless would be prioritized. The students perhaps in foster care, I think, may also be on that list. Julia can supplement, or Joanne or Lilia, others that I'm leaving out. But the point is that there's a set of priority categories that the state has indicated. I'll give an example of a situation that a family that I've worked with, where the student was not in a substantially separate class, but had a lot of needs and a lot of related services and a lot of supports throughout the day. We had to advocate to kind of overcome, in a way, the priority categories because he wasn't in them. But I think one of the considerations is also if the student has had a demonstrated track record of not being able to do well in remote learning, a student with disabilities, then they should also be considered for priority status. And that's the argument that we had to make with the school for this student, because he was technically, through his IEP, in an inclusion setting. But we documented with the parents all of the difficulties that he was experiencing through the remote learning and being online and virtual. And we were able to advocate and get the district to allow him to come into a cohort that was in a hybrid mode so that he could be at least getting some portion of his day in the school building. I hope that answers the question, but Julia, anything you would add?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's a really thorough answer. I would just add to that it's a really good question. There's this is no slam dunk answer. The state government, the governor, the commissioner of the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education have been very clearly saying to school districts that they should be reopening safely. They have made it very clear that not just the students with disabilities who have significant and complex needs that the state has defined for district, for all of us, but that districts should be making sure that all students with disabilities are in person as quickly as possible. And here we are a year later, where we know that many students still have not had in-person learning opportunities. The state has audited some districts who have been still totally remote. So I think it's the kind of thing where, like Mike talked about with this client, advocacy for individual children in a district, advocacy district-wide can still help to move things forward as districts are figuring out how to do things safely. The State Department of Ed has also said that if in-person services can't be provided within the school buildings, districts should be working to look at whether there's a way to provide in-person learning within community sites safely, and to also think about whether or not there's a way to provide in-person learning at home if they're not able to provide, either for the family's health reasons or the school building access, that they can't provide in-person learning in schools. So there's a lot of great policies written on paper about having to move more quickly to provide in-person learning safely. But unfortunately, it really does require often the kind of advocacy that Mike's talking about.
Thank
So you could definitely call if it's more specific information about what's going on in your district, and and also all preschoolers who have disabilities, 3- and 4-year-olds are also considered a first priority coming in terms of learning. So do call our helpline, because based on the facts of what this family is experiencing, we may be able to give some more targeted advice or suggestions of how to go forward. Go ahead, Lily, sorry.
Thank you both. We have one more question for this break. How are rates for in-person services altered when the district is saying all students are remote?
How are the rates?
Rates.
Oh,
So
right,
how-
right.
yeah.
Right.
How might our rights be altered for in-person services when the district is saying all students are remote?
Well, this is happening in some places, right? I mean, this is, I think, sort of, Julia, part of what you just referred to, where there are still some districts where they're not having anybody back into the building. And I don't think that there's, in those places, if nobody's coming back, I think, you know, the pressure is to get the district to open up somewhat, but I don't know that there's a way to advocate for a particular student to go back if the decision at the district level has been made that nobody's coming back. Have you seen successful advocacy in that situation?
Well, I think for some of the district, what the state government has said is even for the districts that have some of the highest rates of COVID within their communities, the state has said very clearly that by itself doesn't mean that districts should be totally remote, that the school district should, and still for the districts that are still totally remote, I believe the State Department of Ed has made clear that they would expect those school districts to be figuring out how to at least provide in-person learning for some of the smaller numbers of students that we've been talking about who have more intensive and high needs. But where it isn't happening, I know what families are doing is they're trying to advocate both for their individual students as well as collectively. And I think there has been some progress made in some communities based on that, but it's very complex because obviously they have to open safely. They have to figure out how to make sure the buildings are safe or how to find other sites, other buildings in the community. So it's hard and it's tough. And it's like what Mike said at the beginning, there is no magic wand. But I think there is a lot of support with some of the policymakers to support parents who are in the communities that are totally remote now to begin to create more options quickly in a way that's safe for teachers, for students, and for families.
The other thing too, and I think this was part of what you said, Julia, but just to put a fine point on it, I mean, the state has been clear that in-person doesn't have to mean in the school building. It can be in other places or even in the home. Now, I haven't seen a lot of that being implemented, but it is contemplated, and it's certainly something to advocate for and ask for, even if they're not letting anybody back into the building just yet. They could send a related service provider to the home or to a community setting.
I mean, these are such good questions because the law is clear and the policy is clear, is that every child's IEP is supposed to be fully implemented as of last September. And there are some students for whom that is simply not possible with totally remote learning. So there's this dichotomy of advice, right? And that's why some kids end up just really slipping through the cracks while changes are made to open up the doors to more kids. Which is why Mike is going to talk more about compensatory services.
Yes.
Before we move on, I just want to share a comment from somebody in the Q&A. They're saying that their advocacy has worked to a degree in Somerville. They have a special education pilot that is 2 hours a day, 4 days a week, and it's in-person learning provided by volunteer teachers. So if anyone else has found a solution like that, please share your resources and experiences in the Q&A.
What that makes me think of is this is not the same as services provided by a school or direct implementation of the IEP, but I know a lot of families are going to the, gosh, and I'm going to blank on, like, I think there's a term that describes these, but I have a set of clients right now whose son is going to the, I think it's the YMCA for 2 days a week, where there are adults there who can supervise and help him log in and do the remote instruction. It's not teaching and it's not implementing the IEP, but at least it gives the parents 2 days of respite where they can actually do their own work and not have their son at home learning remotely. So there may be options like that in your community where there are sites, where if it's appropriate, a student can at least have an alternative place to, be around some peers and get some supervision from somebody other than the parent. I believe it's the Department of Early Education and Care that has guidelines about those sites.
Right, and then there's also been advocacy in some communities for the school districts to look at how to provide special ed personnel in those sites so that, as Mike was saying, so that there may be a site that's in the community where special ed staff could go safely and provide the special ed support so that the kids going to programs like that are actually getting their IEPs implemented in a way that's less restrictive, where they're with kids with and without disabilities safely. So there are communities with very high rates of COVID. Somerville, is beginning to look at options. Lawrence is slowly beginning to open. Boston's beginning to serve some students. So high rates of COVID, and fortunately the numbers are beginning to go down, knock wood, nationally and statewide. But it is possible, but it really takes the teachers, the parents, and the administrators figuring out creatively how to do it in a way that's safe for everybody. And it's just way too slow. And everybody's working so hard, and it's still too slow for too many kids. Should I go on now, Lilia?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, which brings us kind of, appropriately to COVID-19 compensatory services. So I'm going to share just kind of 3 general points first. And I'm sure that there have been chats that have spoken about this before, so this is probably refresher information for folks, but I'll just say, I began having comp ed conversations in my cases back in August, September. And guess what? We're still having those conversations now because students are continuing to accrue, or should be, the need for compensatory services because they're still not getting everything that they should be getting during this time. So I guess the first point is this is really like an ongoing conversation, or one that may need to be revisited multiple times. So first, just a reminder that it's really IEP teams that must make individualized determinations about whether a student is entitled to compensatory services and what those might be. So it's not something that should be decided without the parents' input or without the team's input or in a generalized way. These must be individualized determinations based upon each student's needs. Secondly, districts are required to fully consider information and input provided by parents regarding what remote learning has been like, and has the student been able to access remote learning, and what has their progress looked like. So I think some of the really helpful language in these guidances that have been put out by the state really sort of speak to the fact that in many ways, it's parents who have the day-to-day eyewitness account of how progress has been going, at least where it's been remote learning. Often, we go to the IEP meeting and we hear, well, you're not in the school every day. Like the teachers are the ones who know how the student is doing, but the shoes, as one of my colleagues likes to say, the shoe's a little bit on the other foot now in some ways with remote learning, because the parents are the ones sitting there so often helping the student engage in their learning. So parent input must be considered. And finally, there's kind of 3 different types of support that students might be able to receive as compensation or as make. One is general education recovery support, which is, the kinds of things that schools should be offering to everybody during this time because, everybody's learning has been disrupted in certain ways. And so if that's being offered on a school-wide basis, certainly students with disabilities or students who have an IEP should also be entitled to that general education support. Secondly, extra makeup IEP services. So if a student hasn't been receiving all of the services in their IEP, or they've been not making progress or regressing on their IEP goals, they may need extra services. And the third category is some students will need new services that weren't in their IEPs before, but it's because the pandemic and the remote learning has caused new areas of disability to arise. And the school is obligated to account for those new disabilities and add additional services if necessary to the IEP. So those are 3 general points. Now here's the sort of the tool that you can use. The state has put out 5 questions that the IEP team should be walking through and considering when they have these individualized determination meetings. And so I think it's really helpful to know those questions before you go in and to have your answers ready to go when the school asks these questions. And I've been to a number of these compensatory IEP meetings already. And so far, the ones that I've been to, they do walk through these 5 questions. And so it's been really helpful for my clients to be prepared with their answers. So the first question is, are there services in the student's IEP that either were not offered at all, or that may have been offered, but the student couldn't access them during the period of suspended in-person instruction. So if there were missed services, either because the district didn't even offer them, or maybe they were offered, but the student couldn't participate, that's important to know. Secondly, to what extent has the student demonstrated regression in skills? Well, what does that mean? It means the student was able to do something before the pandemic, and now they can't do that thing anymore. So let me give you an example. I have one client where the student is in second grade, and prior to COVID, the IEP had documented that he had mastered 31 sight words. He's reading. He has a reading disability. But now the parents are sitting at home trying to have him read those sight words, and he can't read them. He can only read 2 of the 31 words that he could read before COVID. That's a regression. If you're losing those sight words and you can't do what you were doing before, that's an example of a regression in skills. Of course, there could be social skills and many other kinds of skills, not just academic skills, that could regress or get worse during this time. But even if the student hasn't gotten worse or regressed, have they simply failed to make effective progress toward their IEP goals in the general curriculum? Getting out that IEP document and looking at all those benchmarks that are supposed to be measurable, has the student been making progress toward those? And if not, it's important to document that and share it with the school. Fourth, does the school or district have any of this general education recovery support? And would the student benefit from it? And if so, it's important to get that documented. And then finally, after going through these other 4 questions, are there compensatory services that the student really needs in order to make up for things they either didn't receive as services, or for lost skills, or for simply the failure to make progress? So going in with your answers prepared to these 5 questions can be, the best way to really make progress in a meeting about compensatory ed. And I think, that those 4 domains for success can also be a helpful tool, because you can think about regression or lack of progress in areas across the board, not just in a single area or silo. So I'll pause again there, Lilia, to see if there's any questions about compensatory ed.
Thank you. Yes, our first question is, are COVID compensatory services only for lost learning or services between March and June last year, or do they include services since September too?
Well, I'll say what I think, but Julia, you can correct me if I'm not getting it quite right. I would say it's for the whole period of time. Now, what's been happening in some of my cases, as I said before, is there was an initial conversation about comp ed, from the spring, like as we were coming back to school, and there were some agreements that were made in my cases about what the student was entitled to. But that doesn't end the conversation, because, things have continued to, to go forward from there. And we're going to have to go back and have a second conversation and get another installment of compensatory education. Also, for some of my clients, the only thing that the district could really offer right now is more remote compensatory education. And that's not what they want. That's not going to help. That's the whole problem, is that it needs to be in person. So they're kind of reserving their right to compensatory education until things are back in person. And that's when they want the extra services to come, when their student can actually be with, in person with the provider. So I think, it could be different in every circumstance, depending on when you've had the conversations with the school. But really, I guess I would say that the outside limit would be the 2-year statute of limitations under the IDEA, but you ought to be able to recover for that whole period of 2 years at least, would be my first blush response to that question.
Yeah, there's been a lot of, I agree with you totally, Mike, and there's been a lot of confusion about this, because when the state wrote their policy about COVID compensatory special ed services, I think they would tell you now that they assumed that schools would be open by the fall, so that there was only a need to address the what they were calling COVID compensatory services for this last school year in the summer. And now, obviously, unfortunately, I don't know I don't know if any of us expected we'd still be where we are today. So the state has been very clear. Compensatory services are a remedy that were available before COVID as well. And the thing that the state did that was different is they said that for this past period, every single child's IEP team had to discuss whether or not the child needed compensatory services, because they knew something as pervasive as a pandemic was requiring this decision to be made about every single child. The state has made clear that these decisions are going to need to be made for many students going forward, and that districts can choose, if they have their meeting for last year in March 5th, they can talk about compensatory services, whether the child needs them, all the way up until March 5th. And then if the child needs another IEP meeting from March 5th until whenever the school's open, then there might need to be another IEP meeting. So if a child's IEP isn't being implemented and those answers to the questions are the same and the child is either regressing or not making sufficient progress, they are still going to have a legal right, most likely, to some compensatory services. But it's always going to be an individual kid determination. And I think there's so much confusion right now in the school level because of the way the first policy was written by the state, and they're trying to clarify that the fact that the first policy was only talking about last school year doesn't mean that kids may still have a need for compensatory services for what's going on in the current school year. I don't know if that made it more clear or more confusing, but there's so many questions from special ed directors, from parents, from team leaders about this. The bottom line is, anytime a child's IEP isn't being implemented during the pandemic, and the answers to these questions are yes, they're regressing, or yes, they're not making effective progress, then it's something that absolutely the team needs to address, whether or not and how many compensatory services a child might need.
We have a lot of questions rolling in about compensatory services. So I'll just do a couple more. Our next question is, oh, I just lost it. There it is. Our district offered only 1 extra week of extended school year for compensatory services, March through June of 2020. Is that enough? This is a sub-separate class for an autistic student.
It's hard. Mike, I don't mean to jump in. Do you want to go first?
No, I mean, I guess what I was going to say, it's kind of hard to know what's appropriate or not appropriate. I mean, it's always hard to sort of answer questions about a specific situation without knowing more of the details. I'm not sure I followed all of the parts of that.
Yeah, I think the question is, it's like everything about the individual of IEP. It's the eye of this. It's also individualized about what amount and type of compensatory services are going to make the child whole, or as whole as possible. As Mike said, you can never totally make up for the harm of a child not getting what they need in real time, but the goal is to make the child as whole as possible. So whether it's not necessarily a 1-for-1, it's not necessarily the case that a child will be entitled to 5 weeks of speech therapy for every session of 5 weeks of speech therapy that they missed before. It may not be a 1-to-1 correspondence, and sometimes it will be and sometimes it won't. And so that's when the discussions of the team are so important. But if you believe that what the school has offered is not sufficient, then you as a parent still have a right to appeal that and to go to the state and file a complaint, either with the complaint mechanism in the state. I don't know, we could probably drop down those links too, Lilia, or to go to mediation or to a hearing. So if you don't agree with the team's decision, you can dispute that, and we can give you more information about how to do that if you contact our helpline.
Thank you. I know we have some more slides to get through, so I'm going to pause on the questions for now. And I'll just say I put the helpline number in the chat again, if anyone would like to discuss their question more in depth with our advocates.
So the next slides, I think, are really just links to resources I mean, I'm sure everybody is already familiar with Mac's COVID resource page. These are just some links to some of the things that we talked about, like the homeschool communication letter or parent communication letter. I didn't mention it, but I hope folks are also aware of the remote education log. That is a tool that's online that was developed by Mac, and I think also Mass Families Organizing for Change. That's a way that you can help to document your students' remote education, and that can come in really handy for these compensatory education conversations if you're documenting the services that they received or did not receive. And there's sample emails and also a Q&A. I guess the fall reopening one is probably not so relevant. This was from fall reopening before. There'll be another fall reopening before we know it, but a Q&A on compensatory services as well. And then the last one is just links to a couple of DESE, Department of Elementary and Secondary Education guidances, of which there have been dozens and dozens, it seems like, but here's two of them that kind of speak to some of the things we're talking about today, which is the social emotional well-being of students, staff, and families, and then a guidance about student engagement, learning, and well-being during remote and hybrid learning. So both of these guidances contain a lot of kind of helpful tips and things that schools can do to make it better. They're guidance, they're not requirements. But again, as I said earlier, even being able to say to your child's school, like, the state says these are things that they recommend that you do, can be helpful. Sometimes they may not have actually seen the guidance at the school, so they may not have seen it before. And if you can take it in and show it to them and make some requests, it's nice when the state guidance is backing you up and backing up what you're asking for. So that's it. And then just included in the slides, contact information, both for Mac, and Lily has been putting this in the chat as well. And then also for our project at the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative. If there's a particular issue related to trauma, you're welcome to reach out to my colleague, our colleague, Attorney Bettina Neuefeind, or myself, and our contact information is there. And that's all the slides.
Bravo, thank you.
Before we go to the next question, I know some people will have to jump off, but Mike has agreed to stay until 9 to answer more questions. Thank you, Mike. If as you leave, Joanne's posted the evaluation feedback for us on a poll, and also in the chat, if you have any ideas for what topics you might like for next month's chat, please share those with us as well. And thanks, Mike, for staying for a few more questions.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Do you have any tips on having conversations around requesting summer session, extended school year, for kids on IEPs that have previously been denied those services? It seems like this is the perfect summer to take advantage of these services.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess where I would just start is with, with what the legal standard is for extended school year services, which is that there's got to be a likelihood of substantial regression if the student doesn't receive services over the summer. So that's a place to start. And I think to the sort of second part of the question, whatever the likelihood of regression may have been, before COVID, it's a new day and it's a new situation, and it certainly makes sense to go back and have that conversation again and really talk about, especially if the student has been spending a lot of time in remote learning and that hasn't been going well, the need to really have those summer services to prevent even further regression. There may have been regression during the school year, not just during the summer. And so certainly any regression that's happened during the school year would make a strong case that it's likely to continue if there's no services over the summer. I've actually seen in a lot of my cases, some districts being more open to the idea of ESY during this time, even if they had denied it previously, because there's a recognition that the kids have lost so much and they don't want to be on the hook for even more compensatory education than they already may be. So they've been a little more, easygoing about giving that when parents request it.
And I think there's many districts are already beginning to think, and there may be some infusion in funding from the state and the federal government about how to open up summer education for all kids, for kids without disabilities, as well as kids with disabilities. I don't think any district has definite plans yet, and we don't know exactly what state COVID will be. But I think people are aware that there's going to be a need for many kids to have services over the summer that didn't used to have them before. And the other thing just to underscore is I'm sure people who are on tonight have had frustrating meetings, either trying to get the in-person learning your child needs or the COVID compensatory services. And we've heard from many families that these COVID compensatory meetings have not elicited the information from families that is going to be so important to proving whether or not a child needs compensatory services, which is why it's so important to look at those 4 questions, whether you're advocating for more in-person learning or for more effective remote learning or COVID learning. You, as Mike said, when families, even if you're not asked, if you've got videos from on your phone showing how your child has been trying to access remote learning and hasn't been able to, or a documentation of the behavioral outbursts that maybe your child has been experiencing, or their loss of social skills or sight reading skills, that information can, even for that family asked whether 1 week is enough. We know that there have been team meetings where the school district doesn't ask the parents or give the parents an opportunity to demonstrate what they're seeing at home. So I think that's the thread of all of this, is that your information of what you're seeing can really make a difference legally and informally as well, as in terms of getting the results for your kids.
Thank you. And if folks want to get a look at those questions again, the slides will be posted to our website tonight, massadvocates.org/events, and they'll also be sent out to all registrants next week. Our next question, I think there's probably a lot of people in this situation. My son's district is offering us compensatory teaching within the same school year, but not any added time. He's turning 22 next year. Is it possible to add compensatory time beyond his birthday?
I'm gonna let you take that one, Julia.
Yes, it is possible. Have been awards of compensatory before COVID. There have definitely been courts and informal resolutions where students require compensatory services, and they need those services after they've aged out at 22. And in fact, the Department of Ed made it clear that for the students who've turned 22 during COVID, they should be priority students for these compensatory meetings, because they are going to need their compensatory services when they turn 22 to help them with their transition to wherever they're going next. So it is possible. Our office is also working on some legislation that is going to be filed to make it hopefully easier to help fund some of those compensatory services for the students who have exited special education. But the bottom line is, legally, yes, it has been allowed and permitted in the past. But all these things, sometimes take advocacy to make them happen. And the state is clear about that in their guidance as well, that it is allowable, and for many students, they will need compensatory services after they've exited special ed. Good questions.
Next question is, if the district is 100% remote, can the parent ask the district to pay for or provide the services through private professionals?
I think so. I mean, I think that's something that could be advocated for. I mean, the state has made clear that schools should try to maximize in-person learning for students, particularly with significant and complex disabilities. And if there's no district personnel who are either willing or able to do it, then as an advocate, yes, that would be my next question, would be, who could you contract with to provide this service? Doesn't mean it would be easy to do. And probably, in most districts, more likely that they would have somebody on staff who that they would try to sort of exhaust first before going to a privately contracted situation. But it's not off the table. It's definitely something that could be advocated for.
I really agree, Mike, and especially because the state has made it clear that every child's IEP should be fully implemented, and if it can't happen in the school building, then it can happen at home, if as long as it can be done safely, or in a community setting. So if a family or advocate is able to identify a community provider who can provide the services in person safely that are needed to implement the IEP, I agree there's a strong legal argument that that's something the district would have to do if they, for some reason, can't do it with their own staff.
Thanks. And MAC also has just come out with a new video series about special education rights during COVID-19. So I'll put a link to that in the chat again, but that might answer some of your questions. Our next question is, what if your district is trying to push off a compensatory discussion? Mine has not even responded to my question about it and told another mom that they'd hear from her in the spring.
Well, I know that, there was guidance from the state that for certain students, the expectation really was that these meetings would have happened by December 15th, 2020, for certain students that are in priority categories. So there's sort of a clear indicator if the student is in one of those categories that there was an expectation that discussion would have happened already. But I think even aside from that, if you've requested it, and they're refusing to meet with you, that's not okay. And so I wonder whether that's the kind of thing that could be addressed to PRS. I mean, is that kind of a violation that if a parent's requesting a meeting and the district's refusing to accede to the request, that an online complaint could be filed with PRS to try to apply some pressure to get that meeting to happen? I guess that's what I would think of.
Yeah, and Lilia just dropped down that link. PRS is the problem resolution system of the state where you can file complaints. And I think that's, I agree, Mike, that could be a very viable avenue. I think if you have your annual IEP meeting coming up, then that you can also discuss compensatory services as well during that annual IEP meeting. But I agree, if you've requested that, at this point in time, there's not that many months left in the year. So I think it's appropriate and legally very appropriate for parents to push for the meetings if your child needs this determination made sooner than later. School districts can also agree if you as a parent want to make this decision more informally outside of the IEP meeting. It depends on your situation whether or not that's a viable route, but that might be another way to expedite things. If you as a parent in the school agree, you can have an informal discussion. If you agree on the child's need for compensatory services and the amount, then the district still has to document it in the same way. And if you don't agree, then you can go ahead and push for a formal IEP meeting. So that might be another thing, depending on your relationship with the school, you could try the informal route if they're willing to do that. And that could happen more quickly.
I was just talking to a colleague of ours, an attorney who represents families in a large city in Massachusetts, I won't say which one, who just reached out this week because she was having a meeting with district officials to discuss sort of some district-wide policies and procedures for starting to initiate, more robustly having compensatory education meetings with parents. And so on the one hand, I was happy that the district was reaching out to an advocate for ideas about how to do that. But I was also dismayed that here it is February, and you're only now starting to think about how you're going to have these meetings. So it may be that some districts are late to the ballgame.
I think, yeah, many districts are late, and I don't know of any districts that are on time for all kids with disabilities. So it's a problem. It's a big problem. How many more questions do we have time for, Lilia? One more?
We can do one more. Yeah, we have so many good ones coming in. I'm going to squeeze in two more if I can, because I think we've got two really important questions. So the first one is, I signed my child's IEP last week and COVID-19 questions were not asked or discussed. Can I ask the team to meet again?
Yes. Again, the there can be a separate meeting about COVID compensatory services. The state's been very clear about that. It can be in your regular meeting, but it's also very clearly contemplated it can be a separate meeting. That was an easy yes.
Those are rare. All right, our last question is, should we be expecting DESE to come out with new guidance regarding some of this confusion about eligibility into this school year?
I'm not sure what they mean by eligibility for compensatory services, but yes, the state, yes, yes, there is ongoing advocacy at the state level around further guidance around compensatory services. We are not the only advocates and attorneys who've been raising these issues. I definitely think we could expect more guidance, hopefully sooner than later, from the state. They're aware that there's a lot of confusion. That's a really good question. And so we are all very much hoping this guidance will help clarify some of this going forward. Great. So first of all, Mike, thank you so much. That was so helpful. Great tools. I think people are going to really be very excited to get the slides so they can use these resources. Thanks so much to all of you for your ongoing commitment. For next March, it will be over the year marker. And we just really appreciate your diligence, your dedication to equity for your students with disabilities, and for spending, you must be exhausted. Thanks for staying with us till 9 at night, and have a good month. Contact our helpline in the meantime, and we'll see you in a few weeks with less snow, we hope.
Thanks,
Thank you.
thanks for the great questions, and be well.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, everyone. If you have any suggestions or feedback for future chats, you can share those in the Q&A as well. I'll keep that open for another 30 seconds. A lot of good questions tonight.
Yeah. Can you hear my neighbors are doing music outside? It's 20 degrees out, right?
Oh, yeah.
God bless them.
All right, everyone.